All right. So it's exactly 5 p.m. on the hour for Eastern time. I'm watching as participants are coming in slowly, which is great. I'm just going to go ahead and get started just to be conscious of time. So welcome to everybody that's on right now, and welcome to everybody that's going to continue joining. Thank you for investing your time into this episode of Entering Harvard. A huge thank you to Professor Davis for giving us this portion of her time and welcoming this discussion with open arms. A couple housekeeping items as people are joining. Everybody right now is muted by default to ensure that the schedule runs smoothly. The chat feature is open and we will be taking questions through the chat for Q&A at the end. So feel free if you have a question to go ahead and pop that in the chat. We have a few people monitoring that as it goes. This event is being recorded at the moment, so if you do not want your video on, please feel free to hide that now. And then in the chat, there will be a link that's going to be shared, and that leads to a working document compiled by HPDC. It'll have information over our most recent report on Harvard endowment and the prison industrial complex, links to Tamara Lanier's lawsuit, and then as well as a link to Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign's most recent lawsuit against Harvard University, which was filed on February 19th. So go ahead and check that out in the chat. It should be linked here in just a second. I'm giving time for people to continue and join before I really get started. Wow. All right. So we thought it would be important to explain why this event is called Entering Harvard. If Amanda, you could go ahead and share your screen if you're there. Perfect. All right. So this event is called Entering Harvard. Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, HPDC, seeks to sever ties between the Harvard University endowment and the prison industrial complex. Just 30 miles separate Harvard from the largest maximum security prison in Massachusetts, the Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center. Sousa is located at 100 Harvard Road. There's a sign as you're driving reading Entering Harvard, and that greets motorists as they drive from the Cambridge campus to the prison. It's making an ironic symbol as well as drawing an indirect line from Harvard University to the prison industrial complex. This political education project hopes to shed light on our campus and the cages that helps finance them and the road to abolition. So you can go ahead and stop sharing that. Great. So now I want to hand it over to Gia Johnson, who is going to lead us through a grounding exercise to prepare us for this discussion. Grounding exercises at times are unnatural, but are necessary for preparing a space for vital conversation. It allows us to gather from all aspects of life and intentionally make space and allows us to be present within the moment. It's a form of self-care, which is important for all forms of organizers. Gia Johnson serves as the program director for McCormick Theological Seminary, Solidarity Building Initiative for Liberative Carceral Education at Cook County Jail. She's hyper-focused on justice making and solidarity building with individuals and communities impacted by mass incarceration. So if you just join me in welcoming her.
Gia, I think you have to click unmute.
Well, good evening or good afternoon. Again, my name is Gia. I'm delighted to be here with you all this evening. So I'm just going to ask that everybody, just want to invite everyone just to kind of settle in right wherever you find yourself as you are able. I'm going to invite you to root your feet to the earth as if the earth is rising from beneath you. For others, you might want to imagine that your feet are being rooted to the earth as if the earth is rising from beneath you. And just begin to maybe get broad in your chest, maybe shake a little bit. Take up some space as it's comfortable for you and as you are able. And what we are going to do this afternoon is we are going to breathe as resistance. Because as my sister has told me, we must breathe. For others, breathing might evoke some anxiety, so do as you are able what feels comfortable to you. So I'm going to invite us to direct our attention, our awareness to our breath. Feel what it feels like to have the breath go up and in your lungs. Imagine or feel the rising and collapsing of your chest. Begin to hear the sound of your breath. Inhale slowly and exhale. Inhale and exhale. Inhale and exhale. Inhale what it feels like when you are most creative. Exhale collective imagination. Inhale what it feels like to know that you have been seen and heard. Exhale the desire for others to be seen and heard. Inhale what it feels like to receive the wisdom of your ancestors, those ancestors who breathe light, life, and love, those ancestors who are a part of the great cloud of witnesses in the fight for freedom, and those ancestors who are a part of your family lineage. And exhale a calling in of the power of the wisdom of our ancestors to breathe light, life, and love into this movement for prison abolition. Begin to slowly inhale and exhale. Begin to prepare your mind and your body and your spirit by gathering your creativity, our collective imagination, our desires for others to be seen and heard, and the power of the wisdom of our ancestors. Begin to prepare yourself to be present in this moment, on this evening, for this conversation with one of the mothers of the prison abolition movement, Angela Davis, and a rising community organizer and prison abolitionist, Eboni Nash. And let us breathe as an act of resistance because we must breathe. Ashe.
Thank you so much, Gia. That was absolutely wonderful. And I appreciate grounding moments in all forms and aspects. So, hello, Professor Davis. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Doing well, as well to be expected. I follow your work, and recently, as we were kind of talking about earlier, you've been called upon intensively. I just want to take a moment to affirm you in saying that we see you and we appreciate the hard labor that you are putting forth for us and for our future generations, and just thank you and all of that.
And thank you for the work that you're doing. And I'm really, really happy to be a part of this conversation this afternoon.
Yeah. I also want to echo again what a huge honor it is to be in conversation with you. I know I speak on behalf of many folks on this call whose scholarship has been influenced by your work. One student in particular at the Divinity School, Ashley Lipscomb, just received her MDiv and is celebrating her birthday today. There are many more people on this call for whom this learning opportunity is significant. And I know I speak for everyone in expressing our collective gratitude for you at this time. So thank you in entertaining this and allowing a chance for students to have a conversation with you.
Absolutely.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and get started with our questions. As you may know, the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign is part of a broader student movement that organizes under the banner of abolition, inspired by the decades-long work of abolitionists and communities across the country. In the immediate moment, our comrades and other campus communities are focused on campaigns to abolish their campus police and divest from the prison industrial complex. What advice do you have for student organizing in the spirit of abolition within the powerful, oppressive institutional structures of a university such as Harvard? What might be the differences in organizing against the university compared to organizing against the state?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Students have always played a major role, and this generation of students is not disappointing at all. But I think you understand that, especially at elite universities, elite institutions such as Harvard, I think it's especially important to learn the kind of humility that permits students to understand that people behind bars are also making vital contributions. There is often the tendency to assume that if we are affiliated with these institutions, we know more than everyone else, that we are the ones who are bringing the knowledge. And I always insist that knowledge is produced in many sites. And those of us who are professionally trained intellectuals have to be aware of the fact that essential and important knowledge gets produced in other sites, including within prisons. And so I say this because I think it's important to acknowledge that the call for abolition first emerged in the 20th century in connection with the Attica Rebellion. That was the first time I became aware of the fact that it might be possible to develop strategies that are directed towards abolition. Now, in relation to campus police departments, I think it's important to remember that campus police departments are modeled after, and in many instances, directly connected with city police departments. They are a part of the structure of the state. I know that many calls for dismantling police structures are emerging, and it's really exciting to see this. As I was saying to you before the program went live, activists today have the opportunity that is not often offered to us to see the consequences of the work that they've done, particularly work that seemingly has not received any credit. And so now we're seeing all across the country demands for getting cops out of schools, and it's actually happening. It's really exciting that it's happening. I think it's going to be really important for us to develop more imaginative ways of thinking about safety and security. Safety and security is not really provided by police departments. And I was thinking during the grounding exercise, that was a way to feel connected with each other, to feel safe in each other's presence. And I want to thank you for that.
Thank you. So recently you turned over or had the decision to give your archives to Harvard University. Do you have specific expectations for Harvard University with your life's work, or would you like to answer?
Okay. Well, if you really want to know why I decided to give my papers to Harvard, because a lot of institutions were asking, it has to do with the fact that people, especially Black women whom I really love and trust, have given their papers to Harvard. One of my closest friends, June Jordan, who was an incredible poet and who was doing work around Palestine before anyone else. Her papers are at the Schlesinger. Pat Williams, the amazing anti-racist lawyer and professor, her papers are there. Rosa Parks' papers are there. Pauli Murray's papers are there. So my decision was made because I thought that, you know, what an amazing opportunity to spend the next hundreds of years in the company of my friends and comrades. But at the same time, it became apparent to me that precisely because of this affiliation with Harvard, I have responsibilities, not to the institution, but to those who are trying to transform the institution. And so I became very much involved in the campaign around the case of the dismissal of Lorgia Peña from the failure to give her tenure. When you invited me to participate, I said, I have to do this because I could not, with good conscience, maintain that affiliation with Harvard if I don't also help to create more effective and more radical arenas of struggle.
Thank you. And we do appreciate this. I'd like to say that again. And it's exciting to know that your work is next to such great leaders in our libraries at Harvard. So that's amazing. And thank you for doing that. The next question is regarding coming from an HPDC organizer. It says, Professor Davis, you have a precise analysis around capitalism, class, and race. What solidarities are imperative across movements against racism, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, etc.? And how do these relate to the movement to end incarceration?
Well, you know, first of all, let me say that I certainly don't have all of the answers. And I find myself feeling very much like a student during these times. I'm continuing to learn. But I can say that the class structure that is required by capitalism has always been intertwined with race. You know, we often treat racism as a discrete phenomenon, and capitalism is here, and then racism is over here, and there are those who say that we have to try to bring them together in one way or another. But the capitalism that we know is racial capitalism, and I like Cedric Robinson's notion of racial capitalism. The original foundation for the development of capitalism was slavery. Slavery was the basis for much of the original accumulation of capital, what Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital. So there has been a connection from the very outset. And I like Stuart Hall's notion that race is the modality in which class is lived. Race is the modality in which class is lived, so that one cannot really separate race from class. And in relation to the question about solidarities, I don't know whether I would define connections between anti-racist movements and anti-capitalist movements as solidarities, because it seems to me that to be opposed to capitalism should mean, in a very profound way, to also be opposed to racism, and vice versa. The current period has allowed us to witness vast numbers of protests and demonstrations all over the world that were initiated as responses to the horrendous murder of George Floyd, whom we all collectively witnessed during those 8 minutes and 46 seconds that the cop had his knee on George Floyd's neck. And I would say that because we in the US are witnessing the emergence of a collective consciousness of what is often referred to as systemic racism, structural racism, because for so long, the dominant discourse had been, there is no more racism. After all, a Black man was elected president. That's the last barrier to the overturning of racism. And so people began feeling really comfortable in this sense of inhabiting a post-racial environment. But in the recent period, I think people are revisiting their certainty that racism has been abolished and are recognizing that it happens in absolutely brutal ways, but it also happens in the everyday ways. We witnessed the exchange between Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper. But the point that I want to make here is that people all over the world are driven to express solidarity now and to look at the structural racism in their own countries. And I think it's very important for us who live here in the US not to feel so entrenched in US exceptionalism that we think that this is an exceptional phenomenon that's only happening in the US. Racism is global because, of course, colonialism was a global phenomenon, slavery a global phenomenon. And so the racism that represents the inheritances of these eras can be seen everywhere. Brazil, look at what's happening in Brazil. There's even a greater and more intense form of police violence in Brazil, in the UK, in France, in Australia. And so, I think that we need to figure out, how to come together across the borders and lines that separate nations.
Thank you. Just a reminder for participants that we are taking questions in the chat box. So if you do have a question for Q&A, which will take place in 15 minutes, please put it in the chat box for our organizers to view. So with that being said, we're gonna jump into the third question. This question, as you can tell, I'm a big community builder and I love networking. So I'm using my networks and drawing in people's questions that have built me as who I am as an activist. And so this question is coming from a previously incarcerated man who is now the campaign manager for Fully Free, which is a campaign to end permanent punishments. The question reads, with recent events that have happened in the world and with renewed or louder calls to abolish prisons, defund police, etc., attention has again arisen between reform models versus abolitionist models for change. How do you understand this tension? And particularly for those who work for nonprofits, government entities, and in other sectors, how do you understand the tension of working from within an organization to bring about change when that entity or organization is tied to the overall system?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the person for the question. And I suppose my first comment would be that none of us are exempt. Wherever we're situated, we're all affected by the overall system. I don't think there is an inside and outside. I don't think we could ever get completely outside of the system. And so the question becomes, now how do we create arenas of struggle wherever we are? And of course, whenever radical solutions have been proposed, existing forces will attempt to dilute them, to challenge them and overcome them, but much more likely to dilute them, to steer public opinion in ways that can be incorporated into existing structures of power. And so calls for abolition and revolution have always been met with calls for reform. This is not new. But I think what is important to us is to recognize how abolition and reform can coexist in ways that don't undercut progress and radical trajectories that can eventually lead us in the direction of anti-capitalist futures, towards socialist futures. And I know that it was the theorist Andre Gortz who came up with the idea of reformist reforms. There are reformist reforms. There are reforms that will consolidate the existing structure of power. And then there are non-reformist reforms. And Thomas Matheson, who wrote this book on the politics of prison abolition, it was called The Politics of Abolition in the 70s, takes that up and explicates the meaning of non-reformist reforms. And in that connection, I wanted to suggest perhaps that people look at the website of Critical Resistance, because there's a very important chart there that lays out reformist reforms versus abolitionist reforms, abolitionist steps specifically in policing. And so the question is, whether these reforms, whether we're talking about body cameras or community policing or more training for police, or whether we're talking about requiring cops to be liable for misconduct settlements. So I think it's really helpful to look at which ones are reformist and which reforms can help push us in an abolitionist direction. And then at the same time, more generally, I think we have to keep in mind that abolition is not simply about tearing down. For some reason, all of the mainstream journalists just they don't get it. They respond to the calls for defunding the police as if that's all you would do and you wouldn't do anything else. And of course, the whole history of prison and police abolition in this country is based on a critical engagement with anti-slavery abolition and the failure to engage in the productive, the positive side of abolition. Chains were broken, but as Du Bois pointed out, what was necessary was to imagine and recreate a democracy that would be capable of allowing previously enslaved people to fully participate. And let me just say one last thing. I know that time is running out, but I think feminists, oh, thank you for putting up the chart. Great, I see it on the screen. Feminist insights are so important. One sees from the failure to effectively address gender violence that criminalization doesn't work, that relying on law enforcement doesn't work, that prisons don't work. So I think that our approach to abolition has to be a feminist approach, abolition feminism.
Wow. I just had to take a pause after that because that was so life-giving and has answered so many personal questions. And I agree with everything being said. So with that, I'm going to jump down to a different question that is kind of relevant within organizing. This question came from an undergraduate class taught at Hastings College by my professor, and I would consider my mentor, Dr. Laura Logan. And this question is regarding people who are located in rural communities or small communities, considering that myself, I have come from a very small community and have climbed the ladder to a bigger community. The question reads, what advice do you have for emerging activists who want to abolish prisons, but who live in small communities with few opportunities to be part of the larger prison abolition movement? What can we do to end prisons while living in a small local community that doesn't actually have a prison? So yeah, just what small things can we do, or what large things can we do remotely located that can aid in the bigger picture?
Well, I think, now with the spread of social media and with so much work happening virtually, where one is actually physically located does not matter nearly as much as it used to. And of course, in rural communities are usually the site of prison construction. There may not be a prison in her community, but one of the campaigns we have to always encourage is campaigns against prison construction, moratorium against prison construction. And so there's also the question of the police in these small rural communities. And we don't treat prisons as isolated from larger structures. Doing work against police crimes, police violence, police racism, also allows us to broaden and strengthen our movement to abolish prisons. So I usually ask people what they most enjoy doing themselves. When people are seeking to participate in and become a part of radical movements, I think it's important to find what it is that is also going to bring pleasure and joy to the person who is seeking. So I'm not sure what she does, what she loves doing, whether she's creative or whether she's a scholar, but there are ways in which one can discover how using one's own talents and one's own desires to contribute not simply to an individual trajectory, but to the process of creating a better world for us all.
Thank you. And engaging in this conversation with somebody else, I was talking about, personally, if I was to answer this question, I would have brought up the importance of voting. And I'm interested in hearing your opinions on that, because I did view an interview you had, or I don't know if it was an interview or podcast you had, over not supporting a candidate, but also just wondering, do you think voting has a position within rural communities and like abolitionist movements?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has to vote. I don't think, sometimes people don't get it, but I have said over and over again that I do not think that electoral politics is the best arena for the expression of radical politics. But I'm not saying don't vote. As a matter of fact, it has become increasingly apparent to me, given the fact that we pretty much know who the Democratic candidate is going to be, that this is a candidate that I'm not excited at all about. And that I wouldn't be driven to vote for the candidate if it was simply only about choosing someone to represent us and to push us in a radical democratic direction. But I do ask the question, which candidate will allow a more open arena? Which candidate would create greater space for organizing? Which candidate would want to shut down organizing? And I think we know who that is. I will not call his name. I never speak his name aloud because that is about according power to him, and I refuse to do that. So we know that that person is not going to help us enlarge the space for activism, for radical organizing. And so I asked myself, who am I voting for? And I come to the conclusion, well, I want to vote for ourselves. I want to vote for my capacity to continue to do work that will radicalize people. I want to vote for the capacity of young people who've done such an incredible job over the last years in laying the ground for an uprising such as the one that we are experiencing. That's what I want to vote for. And when I go to the polls, even though I may have to tick the section that says JB, I'm not voting for him as an individual. I'm voting for the future. And I think it's so important to see electoral politics in relation to a larger political arena. And the politics that you all are engaged in now as you try to force Harvard to divest. That's what we have to vote for. We have to vote for the future.
That was just absolutely inspiring. So thank you. And so this is going to lead me into one of the final questions I have, and then I'm going to open it up for one directed question and then open Q&A. So please, if you do have a question, go ahead and get that into the chat so our monitors can compile them into more focused questions. So this last question has come from one of our organizers, Renda Wabe, a Palestinian organizer. And the question reads, with a little background: in the 1960s, there were close ties between Black and Palestinian liberation movements as a form of joint struggle, and we still see the impact of its legacy today. For example, a mural of George Floyd was erected on the apartheid wall in Bethlehem, and many Black activist delegations have visited Palestine to bear witness to the ongoing colonialism and land grab. You have also been highly scrutinized for your criticism of Israel's abuses. In an increasingly neoliberal, globalized world, how can we be in joint struggle today as opposed to simply identifying our solidarity with one another?
No. Well, first of all, I think we need international strategies more than ever before. The context for all of the work that we're doing is global capitalism. Global capitalism produced the prison industrial complex. If there are such vast numbers of people in prison in the US, more than anywhere else in the world, that has a great deal to do with the emergence of global capitalism and the complete dismantling of the public good, of public services. And so we have surplus populations that are racialized populations that are destined to go to prison. Militarization of the police has been global. And who engages in the training of police all over the world in counterinsurgency strategies to combat the so-called terror in the world. It's the state of Israel. The militarization of the police in our country is very much linked to Israel. And then, of course, we have immigration and attacks on immigrants and refugees around the world. The world is just now experiencing the long-term consequences of colonialism, slavery, the global economic and racial justices historically produced by capitalism and slavery. And Palestine remains an important global site of struggle. So we have to continue to challenge Israel and its policies of expansion and annexation. And Israeli occupation is now a symbol also for so much of the racism in the world. And I think it's very important to recognize that racism is not simply a US phenomenon. It's not simply a South African phenomenon. And that the occupation of Palestine is a very central site for systemic and structural racism. And we've also, as abolitionists, have learned a great deal from the resistance of Palestinians to the occupation. We've learned about the extent to which carcerality can so easily be spread to the community that it's not confined simply to institutions, such as the prison. And as I said before, with the present focus on racist structures of policing, we should keep in mind that it's the Israeli military that continues to train US police departments. We found out that it was involved in the training of the Ferguson Police Department back in 2014. And we have information that some of the members of the Minneapolis Police Department may have also received training from the Israeli military. So the militarization of US policing is so connected to Israel. We can't be so myopic that we fail to take into consideration the larger context. And in doing that, it is so important to continue our solidarity with people who are struggling in Palestine. And let me just say that you mentioned in the question that I had a human rights award revoked, rescinded because of my activism around Palestine. Well, on Juneteenth, and what day is that? Is that Friday or that's Friday? Okay, they're actually going to give me the award. And I'm accepting it because the Civil Rights Institute has actually done a lot of community work. They have gotten rid of the board that existed before. They have engaged in intense conversations, grassroots conversations with people in the community, and they feel as if they're now ready to move in a more progressive trajectory. So I will be so happy to receive the award. And I'm kind of glad, even though it was a shock to me and I was really angry and upset, but I'm kind of glad that that happened because it gave people the opportunity to think more deeply about what it means to embrace human rights. Are there some people who deserve human rights and other people who don't? I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing in the way the police treat Black communities and Latinx communities and indigenous communities. So yeah. that was a good struggle.
Thank you, and congratulations. I don't know if anyone else felt a round of applause among the 400 participants we have here, but everyone is super excited for you, and I'm looking forward to watching that. So thank you, congratulations. It has hit time for Q&A, so I'm done with my part, but I just want to let you know what an honor it has been to have this brief conversation with you. It's as if my whole life's work has led to this moment, and now I can breathe again. But thank you for always inspiring me, inspiring all of us on here. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda. She has something to say real quick, and then we'll get into Q&A. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Eboni. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Professor. In addition to Professor Davis today, we also have a special guest who goes by the name of Ms. Tamara Lanier. She is the plaintiff in a lawsuit against Harvard right now, and we're giving her the chance to ask a question. Ms. Lanier, could you please unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. I thank you for this opportunity, and I wanted to say that I stand in solidarity with the students. Our campaigns somewhat mirror each other, but specifically I wanted to ask Ms. Davis your opinion on reparations.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I wish you success in your suit. And yeah, reparations have been a topic of conversation for a very long time. And I think we are beginning to recognize that the most effective form of reparations will involve rooting out systematic and structural racism. You know, I think that we have thought too narrowly about reparations. We've imagined them as simply a check to individuals. And, you know, not all Black individuals need a check. You know, I mean, I don't need a check. I'm not super wealthy, but I don't, you know, I wouldn't want a check, even though I'm descended from slaves. And even though I want to do that work. So I think that, and in a sense, that's a kind of neoliberal approach, the focus on the individuals. So for me, reparations will involve precisely abolishing the prison industrial complex. The reparations will involve addressing education, reimagining and restructuring our system of education. You know, when you think about the fact that it was Black people, it was the descendants of slaves and former slaves in the immediate aftermath of the so-called abolition of slavery who called for public education. Public education didn't exist in the South. And they were responsible for the creation of a public education system in the South, which meant that public education became not only available to Black kids, but to poor white children as well. And so I think that reparations need to coincide with a radical reimagination of the kind of democracy, hopefully socialist democracy we want to inhabit in the future.
Well, thank you.
And thank you for the question.
So I'm just going to quickly jump in. Hi, everyone. My name is Citlali. Thank you so much, Ms. Lanier, for chiming in and addressing one of the issues that we're sort of really involved in trying to support here through the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, your case for your own case for reparations. I just wanted to give a little bit of time for folks to for us to actually just sit with some audience questions. So I'm actually going to jump in to an audience question. And This question reads, how can we address misogyny, transmisogyny, and patriarchy within liberatory struggles, which so often elevate or center Black cis men at the expense of Black women, trans, and gender nonconforming people? When and how have you had success addressing these factors?
Well, that's a really important question. Thank you so much. And this is why I was trying to emphasize the value of feminist approaches, and not just because feminism is associated with gender, but because the kind of anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism that I'm referring to allows us to bring things together, to, intersectionalities is the term that we use. And it warns us not to adopt a kind of default position. It seems that in moments of crisis, when we see racism directed against Black communities, there is this default assumption that it's about Black men. It's primarily about Black men, because this is the way in which historically Black issues have been formulated. But we know better now. And we are aware of the fact that this phase of the Black struggle has been very visibly led by women, by queer Black women, trans women. And we should recognize that focusing on certain issues confronting specific communities, helps us to adopt a more universal perspective. Looking at the fact that Black trans women are the target of more violence than any other group. Obviously, state violence, racist state violence, police violence, prison violence, but also stranger violence, other forms of individual violence, intimate violence. And so we don't identify with those struggles as a kind of, from the point of view of someone bringing charity to a group. We identify with those struggles because they allow us to more effectively understand how we have to engage in struggle for all of the broader issues as well. And I always like to point out that the trans and gender nonconforming community has given us an enormous gift, because to effectively challenge the gender binary is to demonstrate that it is possible to critically engage with what we consider to be normal in today's world. And so therefore, defund the police as a demand is very much connected with the ways in which trans communities have taught us not to adhere to the notion that just because something exists, it will have to exist forever. And so I was so happy to hear about the demonstration in Brooklyn. My niece, Issa, who incidentally also went to Harvard, participated in the demonstration in Brooklyn for trans lives, and sent me some video and photographs. So I think we cannot go on as if it were 1950. That's what the person in the White House does. He thinks it was. He thinks it's either 1850 or 1950. But we have to carry with us the insights that we learn, and we can't just fall back to these historical default positions of assuming that Black liberation means the liberation of Black cis men.
Thank you so much for drawing those really critical connections. And I know that a lot of folks on the call really appreciated hearing that perspective. So I just want to echo that. The next question that we have from the audience is, what is the largest shift you've seen in the prison abolition and reform movements over the years? What is something that you feel is continuously left out of the conversation that needs to come to the forefront?
Okay, well, I think right now we are all witnessing the most dramatic shift in, and hopefully it will be lasting, in public opinion. But you know, we never know. You know, one of the advantages of having lived a very long time. And it's not always advantageous to be old, but one of the advantages is that one can look back and recognize that things that insights that are so difficult to communicate to people, and insights that takes such a long time to popularize, can suddenly emerge instantaneously, it appears. And as we were saying before the program went live, you know, sometimes you do the same work over and over and over again. People have been calling for abolition for I don't know how long. And then there have always been those people who have said, you are absolutely out of your mind. You know I gave a talk on abolition at Harvard in the 1980s. And people looked at me like I was insane. And I won't tell you who invited me, but but of course now it's entered into popular discourse, and I like to say that we always have to organize as if it were really possible to change the world, even though we don't know whether anything is really going to change. And I'm feeling so excited during this period because we're seeing the consequences of all of the work that people have done over decades, and people who will never receive credit. I'm thinking of Rose Braz, who was the head of critical resistance for many years, who passed away from cancer a number of years ago. You know, she was one of the most committed abolitionists I've ever met. And I find myself wishing that she was still alive today so that she could see that her work really mattered.
Thank you so much. I think I'm just trying to keep an eye on the time and trying to be respectful of yours and everyone's time. So I think, you know, if we could keep the last answer short so we can maybe do some comments to wrap up. But this question is about the term Black Lives Matter. So Black Lives Matter is a slogan that has been co-opted by some liberals and become comfortable for those who still hold racist ideologies. What do you think we should shift to be more specific? Should there be a statement such as, should there be a more specific statement such as Black Power, since Black Lives Matter has become a way for capitalist entities and politicians to feign solidarity? How do you navigate the co-opting of abolition and the Black liberation struggle?
Well, you know, yeah, I understand why people can be upset about that. but I think it's a good thing. When people who we know are not allies begin to feel compelled to use the same language that protesters are using, it's an indication that they want to be on the right side of history, that they don't want to be left behind. So, and you know, I can understand that, but that doesn't mean they really understand that Black Lives Matter. They're doing what's necessary in order to have a future. And to be, I know you asked me to be succinct, but what I would say is that we always have to be willing and ready to up the ante. We always have to come forth with ideas that cannot be co-opted, that cannot be contained. And I can just give you one example. When we developed the notion of the prison industrial complex, we had no idea that it would eventually become so widespread. But when it began to become readily adopted, we said, oh, well, now we really have to push abolition. And now that abolition or defunding has become important, now we have to really push concrete changes in our community. We have to be willing to develop strategies that allow us always to have the upper hand.
Well, thank you so, so much. I know I'm one of many thank yous that we've done throughout this event, but I do want to do a round of applause, you know, whether it's through everyone's reactions or, you know, through any way that we can make it known that we're super thankful for your time. We know that you have been doing, you know, events sort of throughout, you know, the last few weeks and even months, just back to back. So we really do appreciate all of the labor that you bring and your knowledge and your teachings. So with that, I'll just address, I think, the rest of the folks on the call as well. There is one thing that we wanted to share with y'all as y'all are looking to log off, and that's that we actually have another upcoming event that I'm going to be posting in the chat. It's an Eventbrite to our upcoming event with Miriam Kaba. So we're really excited, that we're going to be sort of continuing the conversation about abolition, and in particular thinking about building campaigns on campus. So you can go ahead and register for that event using the link I just posted on the chat. And look out for a follow-up email that we'll be sending out as well. And of course, we've also shared tools through that shared Google Doc that you can access, whether it's more information about the campaign, this different kind of abolitionist avenues that we've taken at Harvard, and the kind of different campaigns that we have going on. So thank you so much, everyone. I'll just you know, say that this has been incredible, and hope the rest of y'all have a great night.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm.